Alrighty. So, starting off with these definitions, how do we feel with these definitions?
Pretty good. They're straightforward.
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward? Okay.
Yeah.
Alright. Cool. Alright. My computer's taking a little while here. And I should start to go. Okay. All right, cool. So here we go, number 6. Okay, so here we got a diagram of a brain here. Okay. So we're looking at A. Which lobe of the brain are we looking at here?
Frontal lobe.
Right, so that'd be the frontal lobe. Perfect. So A would be our frontal lobe. Hey, what about B? What are we looking at here? That'd be the hypothalamus. Cool. So actually, let's kind of dive into these a little bit more depth here. So going back to A. So A was a frontal lobe. What's the frontal lobe responsible for?
Decision making. You mean the?
Right. It's going to be involved with decision making. What else?
Thinking and personality, right?
Right. So thinking, personality, decision-making, logic, planning, all that stuff is going to be taking place in the frontal lobe. Well, processing, right?
Yeah.
What about the hypothalamus? What's the hypothalamus responsible for?
Wasn't it involved in a regulation of different hormones? And I think that's what it was, right?
Right. So it's going to, so it's going to be involved with regulating different hormones. And then as we'll see today, it's also going to be involved with regulating the autonomic nervous system. Okay, good. We're skipping C. So moving down to D. What region of the brain are we looking at with D?
Temporal lobe.
Right, that'd be the temporal lobe. So what's the temporal lobe responsible for?
Temporally, mainly auditory processes, right? Like listening and hearing.
Yeah, so it's going to be involved with helping you process hearing, processing auditory information.
Yes.
What about E? What is E?
Oh, pons.
Pons.
Right, E would be the pons.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the pons do?
Doesn't it coordinate your movements?
Not your movements.
Your breathing.
Breathing, right. So it's going to help you regulate your breathing.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah. What about F?
F is
medulla
oblongata.
Right, F is the medulla oblongata, and so that's going to be responsible for what?
It's also responsible for breathing, balance, and
learning.
homeostasis.
So the medulla is mainly responsible for homeostasis to a little bit of a degree, but it's mostly going to be regulating your
temperature, right?
Your movements, helping you to regulate your body movements. Okay. There's a couple other things that are going to be really important for the medulla.
Kalua.
What else does the medulla do? Give you a clue. It has to do with 2 specific centers that help to regulate some things in your chest.
Breathing center.
Right. There's going to be a respiratory center, and there's also going to be what other center?
Cardiac. Right?
The cardiovascular center. Right.
All right.
Yeah. So it's going to be able to regulate your breathing rate along with the pons. It's going to help you to regulate your cardiovascular system, to regulate your heart rate, the force of your heart contractions, the blood vessels diameter, and things like that. And then it also helps with regulating your body movements too. Perfect.
So the medulla.
Okay, cool. What about G?
Oh
yeah, go ahead.
Is it the autonomic then? The autonomic.
It does help to regulate parts of the autonomic nervous system, and actually we'll take a look at that today too.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, very good question. Very good. What about G?
G is the spinal cord.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah, G would be the spinal cord. Cool. We'll go ahead and just move on from there. So H, what's H?
cerebellum.
The cerebellum. Right. So what does the cerebellum do?
To help with balance.
You're right. So it helps with balance and equilibrium. And then what else does it do? Kind of in that same kind of lane there.
Does it help with muscular activity?
Yes, for more specifically with coordinating your muscle movement.
Coordinating. Okay.
Right. So it's going to be coordinating your muscle movements and then helping you to regulate your balance and your equilibrium. All right, good. What are we looking at with I over here?
Is it the midbrain and the aqueduct?
So I would be the midbrain, and the cerebral aqueduct would be in that same area, right? Yeah, so this would be the midbrain.
Okay, I know what that does.
All right, good. What's the midbrain do?
It's part of the process for the cerebral spinal fluid. It passes through the aqueduct. After the horns, it goes through the horns and then the middle stem, and then it drains through there, right?
Right. Yeah. So the cerebral spinal fluid is going to run through the cerebral aqueducts here. But then when we're looking at the midbrain, there's going to be two kind of elevations on the back side of it.
Yeah.
So if you remember, this is where we would find the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. And those are both going to be, anyone remember what those are responsible for?
Is it vision?
Yeah, so one of them is going to help with kind of visual reflexes. That's going to be the superior colliculi. And then the inferior colliculi helps with what?
I thought they were
Remember.
visions, but from different views.
No. So the superior colliculi helps with your visual reflexes. The inferior colliculi help with your auditory reflexes.
Oh, auditory. Oh.
Yeah. So, and again, we'll come back to those when we get to chapter 21 on Wednesday. Okay, so that's that. J. So J is this structure here. Okay.
Thalamus.
What are we looking at here? Right, that would be the thalamus. So what's the thalamus's role?
Is he the wake sleep cycle?
The more so the hypothalamus, but more so the hypothalamus. Well, what is the thalamus? What's its main overall role?
I thought it was something to do with metabolism. I thought it was the wake sleep or the circadian rhythm, but maybe I mixed it up with the hypothalamus.
Yeah, so the circadian rhythms is going to be done by the epithalamus, and then the hypothalamus too. So those two kind of regulate metabolism, but the thalamus is only there to kind of help relay all the sensory information coming into the brain and send it to specific areas. So this is kind of, remember when I was talking about the thalamus kind of acting like the receptionist?
Yeah.
So this is going to be where all the sensory information is going to come in. Once that sensory information reaches the thalamus will then direct that sensory information to specific areas of the brain where it'll get processed. So thalamus is going to be our relay center. All right, does that one make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, then we have K. And so which lobe of the brain are we looking at here?
The occipital lobe.
The occipital lobe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's going to be responsible for doing what?
For vision, processing vision.
Right, for processing vision. Perfect. Then we have L, which is this very broad band of white matter here.
Yeah.
So what would this be?
The corpus callosum.
Right, the corpus callosum. So anyone remember what the corpus callosum does?
I thought it keeps the hemisphere of the brains together, like deep.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Right. So it's going to connect the left side of the brain, the left hemisphere, to the right hemisphere, and it's going to allow each of the hemispheres to be able to communicate with each other. Perfect. Cool. And then the last lobe of the brain up here would be the what?
Parietal lobe.
The parietal lobe. Right. Perfect. And so what's the parietal lobe do?
I don't remember off the top of my head the parietal. Oh, I actually.
I don't remember.
Let's see. Is that a sensory? It receives impulses for touch, vibration.
Yes, absolutely. So any tactile sensations are going to get processed by the parietal lobe.
Okay.
Beautiful.
All right.
Cool. All right, good. Any questions on this brain here?
No. No.
Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and move forward here. So now question 7. So the blink regulates emotions and is often referred to as the emotional brain.
The limbic.
What would this part of the brain be?
Yeah, limbic system.
Limbic system.
Right, this would be the limbic system. The limbic system. Perfect. Cool. All right, cool. Number 8. So brainwaves can be detected using what?
Electrocephalogram. Electroencephalogram.
Right, an electroencephalogram or an EEG. Right, electroencephalogram or an EEG. Cool. All right, question number 9. So the cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the blank in the ventricles. What do we get for this one?
How do you pronounce it?
By choroid plexus.
Okay, so there's a couple answers you could put for this. So I heard choroid plexus. That was the answer I was looking for. Choroid plexus. But if you also said the ependymal cells, that'll work too. Okay. So the choroid plexus and the ependymal cells are all going to be lining the walls of the ventricles. So as the fluid moves out of the capillaries that make up the choroid plexus, they're going to move through the ependymal cells, and the fluid that comes out of that becomes the cerebrospinal. Okay. Any questions so far on any of these 3 questions here?
No.
All right. Number 10. So the superior and inferior colliculi are located on the posterior aspect of the what?
Midbrain.
Of the midbrain, right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the cerebrospinal, or so the superior and inferior colliculi, they're going to be on the posterior aspect of the midbrain. And then question 11, the 2 cerebral hemispheres are connected by the what?
Corpus callosum.
The corpus callosum. Perfect. All right, cool. Good. Okay, question 12. So the regions of the brainstem that are involved in control of respiration are the what? We got medulla and pons, pons and midbrain, midbrain and medulla, or medulla and cerebellum.
Medulla and pons.
Yeah.
Right, the medulla and the pons are both going to be involved with regulating your respiration. All right, good. Question 13. So inability to control eyeball movement may indicate damage to which cranial nerves?
Oh.
So we got the trochlear nerve, optic, oculomotor, trigeminal, and the abducens nerve. So which of those 4 combinations here, it could possibly lead to damage to, or inability to control the eyeballs?
So trochlear nerve.
1, 3, and 5.
Oh yeah, 1 through 5.
Yeah, so 1, 3, and 5. So the trochlear nerve, the oculomotor nerve, and the abducens.
More than abducens.
Right. Why would the optic nerve not indicate an inability to control your eye movement?
Because isn't that a only sensory nerve, purely sensory? So it doesn't do motor.
Exactly. So Priscilla mentioned that the optic nerve is a purely sensory nerve. All it's going to be doing is going to be receiving sensory information. Okay? So in this case, visual information. So it's not going to have a role in moving the eyes. It's just going to have a role in taking information that the eye is seeing, okay, and then directing that to the brain. Perfect. All right, good. Question 14. And so in what part of the brain would you find the hippocampus? Would that be in the limbic system, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, or the cerebellum?
Limbic system.
Limbic system.
Yeah.
Right, the limbic system. Perfect. Cool. Any questions so far?
No.
All right, cool. All right, question 15. So Louise suffered a stroke last month. Since the stroke, she is speaking without difficulty, but her sentences don't make any sense. So she's speaking with word salad. So for example, today she said, yesterday him lift cloud brother house ship junk. Louise's stroke most likely damaged A, Wernicke's area, B, the primary visual area, C, the common integrative area, or D, Broca's area.
A.
Wernicke's area.
Wernicke's area.
Right, Wernicke's area. So when you damage Wernicke's area, you're not able to speak in a cohesive manner. Okay, you're able to speak easily, okay, but you're not able to make anything that makes sense. All right, good. Question 16. So which lobes of the cerebellum controls balance and equilibrium? So we got the flocculonodular, the anterior and posterior, anterior and flocculonodular, or posterior and flocculonodular.
The
Flocculonodular.
flocculonodular.
Right, just the flocculonodular lobe. Okay, that's the only lobe that's going to be responsible for controlling balance and equilibrium. The anterior and posterior ones are going to be responsible for helping you with your movement. All right, so number 17. So we want to list the roles of the following areas and then describe which lobe of the brain they reside in. So we're going to start with the primary somatosensory area. Somatosensory. Okay. And so let's start with where we would find it. Where would we find the primary somatosensory area?
In the parietal lobes.
Right, we find that in the parietal lobe. Okay. All right, and so what is its role going to be?
Is to sense touch, vibration, and the proprioception, like a sense of where your body is in space.
Yes. So exactly. So the primary somatosensory area can be involved with helping you sense touch, vibration, proprioception, any other tactile sensations is going to be picked up by that specific area. Okay. What about B? So the primary visual area.
Primary,
Which lobe would we find that in?
The occipital.
Occipital lobe.
occipital lobe.
Right. The occipital lobe. Perfect. And so what is its role going to be?
Visual.
Visual
Right. So it's
perception.
going to help
Receive visual
sense.
information.
Yes.
Right. Receive visual information. Perfect. Actually, yeah, let me change this to receive. Receive visual. Perfect. Okay. All right, then we get Broca's speech area. Okay. So where is Broca's area?
The
In the
frontal
frontal
lobe.
Frontal lobe.
Right. So it's in the frontal lobe. And so what does Broca's area do?
It plans your speech.
helps with speech production.
Right. It's going to plan your speech and then also help with speech production. Perfect. So it's going to be controlling all of the muscles around your throat, your tongue, and your larynx. And then the last one is the prefrontal cortex.
Is the frontal
Where would we find the prefrontal cortex?
frontal lobe.
Right. That's also going to be found in the frontal lobe. And what does it do?
It determines your personality, your intellect, and it has your complex learning abilities, like how well you learn.
Right. So it's going to with personality, intellect, judgment, decision making, intelligence, complex learning, pretty much anything that has to do with your executive functioning or higher thinking. That's going to be done by the prefrontal cortex. Cool. Any questions on question 17?
Yeah, does all this information that these nerves pick up on, does it go straight to the thalamus since it's the relay station?
Right. Yes. So her question was, does all the sensory information go straight to the thalamus? Essentially, yes. It's going to take a certain pathway to get there, but it's eventually going to reach the thalamus. Once it reaches the thalamus, then the thalamus can say, okay, this is some kind of sensory information. If you're visual information, okay, you're going to the occipital lobe. If you're auditory information, you're going to the temporal lobe. If you're tactile information, you're going to the parietal lobe. And so it'll be able to direct all different types of information to specific areas of the brain in order to get processed. But before it can do that, it has to get told where to go by the thalamus.
The thalamus is kind of like the receptionist, you're saying, right?
Right. And so the thalamus is the receptionist inside the brain.
For sure.
Perfect. Any other questions? All right, cool. So now question 18. So Bill is having trouble maintaining his balance. So which cranial nerve was most likely affected? What do we think?
Cranial nerve number 8, vestibulocochlear.
Right.
With-
The vestibulocochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 8. Vestibulocochlear nerve. Right. So the vestibulocochlear nerve, as we know, is going to be responsible for helping you with your balance and your equilibrium, as well as with your hearing. So if you're having trouble maintaining your balance, it's most likely an indication that cranial nerve 8 has been one that's been affected.
Yep.
Do you have to specify the vestibular branch?
No, for this question, you don't have to. As long as you give me the correct nerve, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. And then question 19. So describe the pathway of the cerebrospinal fluid starting from where it is secreted to where it is reabsorbed. And then be sure to include the channels they go through to pass from one ventricle to the next. So let's say we're starting with the lateral ventricles. Right? So we're starting with the lateral ventricles. Where is the cerebrospinal fluid going to go next?
Are the lateral ventricles the horns that kind of curve? Like,
Yes.
okay, the horns that curve. And they go to the interventricular, right? Interventricular.
Mhm.
And then is it like an oval like shape? And then there's like a tube?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So once you have the cerebrospinal fluid produced in the lateral ventricles, it'll move through the interventricular foramen, which is kind of like an oval-shaped tunnel or a channel. That's going to move the lateral ventricles into which area next?
Third ventricle.
The third ventricle.
I forget about that one a lot, the third ventricle.
Yes. So make sure we get that one straight. Okay. So now once we have cerebrospinal fluid in the third ventricle, where does it go to next?
Is it the aqueduct of the midbrain?
Right. The aqueduct of the midbrain are also called the cerebral aqueduct.
Into the fourth ventricle.
Perfect. Into the fourth ventricle. Then once it moves through the fourth ventricle, where does it go to now?
Is it the spinal cord?
So
No,
it's what specific area of the spinal?
So from there, the
Subarachnoid?
moves to subarachnoid spaces of the brain and spinal cord.
There you go. That's not how to pronounce it.
Right.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's got to move through the subarachnoid space of the brain or spinal cord. Okay. Or where else can it go? Anyone remember? There's one smaller area that it can flow through.
Central canal of the spinal cord?
The central canal.
Yeah, is it that? Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah. So it can go through one of those three areas. Okay. It's either going to go into the subarachnoid space of the brain, the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord, or it can flow through the central canal. All right. Now, regardless of which area it goes to, it's eventually going to get, it's going to circulate throughout the subarachnoid space or the central canal, and then it's going to get reabsorbed. Where is it going to get reabsorbed into?
Arachnoid villi.
The arachnoid villi.
Nice.
Right. Perfect. So we're going to start with the lateral ventricles. It's going to move into the interventricular foramina, and then into the third ventricle, and then from there into the cerebral aqueduct, and then into the fourth ventricle, and then circulate through the subarachnoid space of the brain or spinal cord or into the central canal, and then it'll eventually get reabsorbed in the arachnoid villi. Perfect. Cool. All right, so that's that. Any questions on the homework or anything from chapter 18 that we haven't talked
No.
about? Okay.
Good.
All righty. So that is that. Just as a couple quick announcements before we jump into today's lecture. So keep in mind that today we have our lab practical. So if you haven't already done the lab practical for today, make sure you complete that. So make sure you complete the lab practical by 11:59 tonight. I'll have those graded by the end of the week. This week's a little bit busy, so I'm gonna try to get it done by Friday. So that's lab practical number 3. That's the last lab practical, so make sure you get it done. The other thing is that exam 4 will be next Monday. And so it's gonna, again, go through the same format. I'll open it at 8 a.m. It's going to be closed at 11:59 p.m. So as long as you take it sometime within that window, you're good to go. However, there will also be a short lecture next Monday as well. Okay. So even though we have exam 4 next Monday, we will also have a very short lecture on chapter 22. Okay, chapter 22 will not be on exam 4. Okay, that'll just show up on the final. That's that. And then the last thing is the career essay. So if you haven't already started your career essay, kind of, again, be thinking about it. That will be due May 11th. On Canvas, there's a place you can upload your PowerPoint, your career essay. You can either upload it onto Canvas or you can email it directly to me. Either one is fine as long as I get it by May 11th. That is that. This week, there's kind of a lot of things going on. This week, so today there will not be a lab for the autonomic nervous system. There is an extra credit lab on chapter 21, which is the special senses, which we'll cover on Wednesday. So that lab is optional. You don't have to do it, but if you do complete the special senses lab, that'll be worth 10 points extra credit. So again, you can do it if you want. If you don't have to worry about it. If you want to do it, you can do it. The instructions are up on Canvas for that. Okay, I think that's everything. Any questions on the billion things that are happening over the next few weeks?
Not right now. Oh wait,
Yeah, not right now at the moment.
Okay.
actually for the final
So,
exam, how many questions? How many is it? We're just gonna, for the final exam, do we have anything, or we're just gonna show up or just turn it in that day, or?
Yeah, so the final exam will be done on Canvas just like normal. The final exam, though, will be 90 multiple choice questions. And then there's going to be 10 kind of organ identification questions. So I'll show you an organ. I'll talk more about it after the next exam. But I'll basically show you, there will be 10 questions where I'll just show you an organ. You have to tell me what it is. And then for an extra point, extra credit, you tell me one of its functions. Okay. And that's pretty much it.
And
So there's no labeling questions. Or I guess not really labeling questions. There's no fill in the blank questions. It's just 90 straight multiple choice questions along with the 10 organ identification questions.
okay.
Sounds good.
Again, that'll be at the end of the semester.
That would be like, oh, darn.
Yes, that's that. Okay. Erica's question, so is the extra credit lab due today? So the extra credit lab, because it's kind of more involved, it will be due on Friday. Okay. So you have the entire week to get it done. Again, most of it you're not going to be able to do until Wednesday when we go over the stuff, but I'll have it due on Friday.
For sure.
Okay. Any other questions?
No, not right now.
No? Okay.
Yeah, not right now.
All right. All righty. So with that, then we will go ahead and go over the autonomic nervous system. Cool. So, everyone's able to see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So today we're going to be looking at the autonomic nervous system. And so in the past, in the past couple of weeks, we looked at how the nervous system is going to be organized. We looked at the different types of neurons we're able to see. We also saw the spinal cord and how it's going to be responsible for helping with reflexes. We saw the entirety of the anatomy of the brain and how it's going to be able to control multiple other things. And so today we're going to be looking at the autonomic nervous system. And we're going to kind of start off kind of just by looking at how it's structured. And then we're going to kind of build onto that from there. Cool. So before we go forward here, does anyone remember what is the kind of overall role of the autonomic nervous system? Don't give me like nitty gritty. Just kind of give me big picture, general role of the autonomic nervous system. What does it do?
Does it manage your heart rate and your breathing and your blood pressure?
Yep.
Right. Yeah, so it's going to be monitoring and regulating all your blood pressure, heart rate, breathing rate, pretty much everything that we do not consciously control, okay, is going to be regulated by the autonomic nervous system. Okay? So pretty much anything that happens automatically within our GI tract, or sorry, within our thoracic cavity or within our abdominal cavity, all of those organs, they're going to be regulated by the autonomic nervous system. Okay? So they're going to need the ANS in order for them to be able to do their job and do their job in a way that helps us be able to survive. Okay. So our goal for today is, again, we're going to be looking at how the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous systems are going to be different from each other. We're going to look at kind of how they're going to differ. We're going to look at the overall structure of the autonomic nervous system, looking at the preganglionic neurons, postganglionic neurons, and then autonomic ganglia. We're going to take a look at how it's going to differ inside the sympathetic division as well as the parasympathetic division. We're going to look at specific neurotransmitters that are going to be used here. And then we're going to end up looking at different types of reactions that we're going to see inside the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, and then look at autonomic reflexes. Okay? So we're going to kind of be hitting a broad range of different things or different topics as we go forward here. Okay. So before we go forward, quick question, got a quick review question from about a week and a half ago. So the cell bodies of motor neurons are located in where? The anterior gray horn, the posterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, or the white commissure?
Anterior gray horn.
Anterior gray horn, do we agree? Do we disagree?
Yeah.
Agree.
Agree.
Right. Cool. Exactly. So the cell bodies of your motor neurons are going to be located in the anterior gray horn. Perfect. Okay. All right. So when we're looking at the autonomic nervous system, like Priscilla had mentioned earlier, this is going to be a structure, a system that helps us be able to regulate all the automatic functions that happen in the body. Right. So when we're looking at our heart, for example, right, we cannot consciously control what our heart is doing. Okay, we cannot consciously control each beating of the heart. Okay? So we're going to need a specific element of the nervous system to help regulate that stuff. Okay? We're going to need a particular element of the nervous system to help regulate how quickly you're breathing and how either cause your breathing rate to increase or cause your breathing rate to decrease, depending on the specific situation that you're in. Okay? So the autonomic nervous system is going to be there to help regulate, your breathing rate, regulate what's going on with your heart, and be able to regulate what's going on with your GI tract and help you be able to move food throughout your GI tract. It's going to be responsible for helping you move your bladder, control your bladder, and do a number of other functions. Okay, things that we do not physically control or have specific elements that we cannot control. Okay? And so when we're looking at it, there's going to be kind of three overall functions or three overall components to the autonomic nervous system. What we're going to do is we're going to find some autonomic, or also called visceral sensory receptors, which are sensory receptors that are going to be found inside the visceral organs. We're going to have some integrating centers in the brain and in the spinal cord. And then we're going to see some autonomic motor neurons too. And so those autonomic motor neurons are going to be able to physically control the actual organs inside of our thorax and in our abdomen. And then a fourth component of the ANS is also going to contain the enteric division, which is specifically geared to control your GI tract. So we'll talk about that very briefly today, but we'll get into that more so when we talk about the digestive system. Okay, so that's where we're going here. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is I want us to kind of be able to compare the differences between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so we're going to kind of think back to a couple weeks ago when we were looking at the somatic nervous system. And so when we look at the SNS, it's going to contain both sensory and motor neurons. So the sensory neurons are going to be able to take in information from the somatic senses, anything kind of across your skin or across the surface of your body, where you're able to sense pain, touch, proprioception, anything like that, across the skin, and then send that information to the brain. And it's also going to be taking in sensory information from your special senses, okay, your vision, auditory senses, olfaction. Okay, all those different senses are also going to be directed to the central nervous system as well. Okay. But these are things that we're going to be able to consciously be aware of and consciously perceive. Okay. So all those sensory input is going to be directed to the central nervous system. And then from there, the central nervous system will then integrate that information, process it, and then determine what kind of motor function needs to be done. And so the somatic motor neurons are going to run from the CNS down into your skeletal muscles to help you control voluntary movements as well as reflexive movements of the skeletal muscle. Okay? So the somatic nervous system is specifically geared to control the skeletal muscle. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, the autonomic nervous system is responsible for regulating everything else. Okay? Anything that is not skeletal muscle is going to be controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Okay? So that's going to be your cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and your glands. Okay? All three of those are going to be regulated by the ANS. So again, we're going to kind of see the same overall pieces and players that we're going to see in the somatic nervous system. And we're going to have some autonomic sensory receptors or sensory neurons. And so those are going to be found inside the visceral organs. And they're going to be able to respond, or they're going to be responsible for taking in sensory information from various organs. Okay? In order to do that, they're going to be working very closely with specific receptors called interoceptors. And so these interoceptors are just receptors inside the specific organs. Okay? There's different types. We can have some chemoreceptors, for example. So chemoreceptors are responsible for monitoring chemical changes happening in different organs, like in the stomach, and monitoring the amount of stomach acid we're producing. There's the mechanoreceptors, which are responsible for picking up on the amount of pressure or stretch that a particular organ is enduring. Okay? And so those interoceptors are going to be working hand in hand with the autonomic sensory neurons, okay? And then taking that sensory information and directing it to the brain. Okay? What's important here is that these are not consciously perceived. Okay? So for example, we're not able to consciously be able to know how much stomach acid we're producing. Okay? We're not able to consciously know how stretched out our lungs are or how stretched out our stomach is or our intestines are. Okay? Those are things that we cannot consciously perceive. Okay, but that is still sensory information that is going to be able to be directed to the central nervous system. Okay? Once that sensory information gets processed and integrated, okay, the integrating center will then tell the autonomic motor neurons what to do. So those autonomic motor neurons are going to be able to regulate the activities that are happening inside those visceral organs and either excite different activities happening in those effectors or inhibit different activities happening in those effectors. And again, any of those motor functions, those are not going to be consciously perceived. Okay? And these ones, we cannot consciously alter them, and we cannot consciously suppress them. Okay? So those are going to be automatic functions that we have no control over. This is all kind of making sense so far, the difference between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think if we dive into it, it'll make a lot more sense.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and go for it here. And it'll make more sense as we go. Oh, yeah.
With the somatic, do we have control over?
Oh.
Yeah, so the somatic nervous system we do have control over. Right, so this is going to be how we're going to be able to control our skeletal muscles. Okay? So we need to walk from point A to point B. If we're putting our hand on a fire or on a flame here and pulling our hand away, okay, those are things that we can control to some degree, unless they're reflexes. But those are all going to be reflexes found in these skeletal muscles.
Okay.
So in some cases, yes, we can control them. In other cases, they're going to happen automatically and we can't really control them. But these ones, typically, we are able to control the somatic nervous system.
So reflexes included are in the somatic nervous system as well?
Yeah, so reflexes that are specifically controlling your skeletal muscles. So there are other reflexes which we'll talk about later on today. But if we're talking about just reflexes like putting your hand on a flame and pulling your hand away, or like stepping on a pin and pulling your leg away, those reflexes would be controlled by the somatic nervous system.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so that's kind of how the whole overall organ systems or nervous systems are going to be kind of working here. So now we're going to kind of get into the nitty gritty here, and we're going to look at the neurons. Okay? And so the specific difference between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system has to do with the motor neurons. Okay? So when we're looking at the somatic nervous system, okay, the somatic motor neurons are going to have a single axon that's going to run from the central nervous system all the way down to your skeletal muscle. Okay? And it's going to be releasing acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. This is nothing new. We've already seen this when we were looking at the neuromuscular junction back in chapter 10, I think it was, or 9. Or I think it was chapter 10. And nothing new here. To have a single somatic motor neuron releasing acetylcholine onto a muscle fiber to cause it to contract. However, in the autonomic nervous system, this pathway is a little bit different. Okay? Not a little bit, it's very different. Okay? Very, very different here. So instead of having a single motor neuron running from the central nervous system all the way down into your effector, in the autonomic nervous system, we have 2 motor neurons that we need. Okay? And those 2 motor neurons are going to be arranged in sequence, okay, with one another. Okay? So the first one that we're going to find is called a preganglionic neuron. So a preganglionic neuron is going to have its cell body inside the central nervous system, okay? And then its axon is going to leave the central nervous system either as a cranial nerve or as a spinal nerve, okay? And then reach a region called the autonomic ganglion. Okay? So the autonomic ganglion is going to be a place where we're going to have neuronal cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Okay? So a ganglion is just anywhere you have cell bodies outside of the central nervous system when you're looking at neurons here. Okay? So this is going to be where we're going to be releasing, or where the preganglionic neuron is going to end. So those axon terminals are going to be found inside the autonomic ganglion. Now, from there, the preganglionic neuron is going to synapse with a postganglionic neuron. And so the postganglionic neuron is going to have its cell body inside the autonomic ganglion. The difference between the preganglionic axon and the postganglionic axon is that the preganglionic axon is going to be myelinated, while the postganglionic axon is going to be unmyelinated. Okay. So this postganglionic axon is going to run from the autonomic ganglion, and then it's going to eventually reach the effector. And then once it reaches the effector, it's going to release one of 2 main neurotransmitters. Okay? It can either release acetylcholine, as we see down here, okay? Or it can release norepinephrine. Okay? So that's going to be how the motor neuron component of the ANS is going to be oriented. So we're going to start with having a preganglionic neuron. Its cell body going to be inside the central nervous system. And its axon is going to be myelinated, and it's going to reach an autonomic ganglion. Inside the autonomic ganglion, the preganglionic neuron will synapse with a postganglionic neuron, which we see over here. And that postganglionic neuron's axon is going to be unmyelinated.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll go and let me stop here. Are there any questions on this process? This is where things get a little bit trickier here. Okay. So we got a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. Both of these are going to be important to help regulate and control your visceral organs. Okay. Any questions here before we go forward?
So those are the 2 motor neurons in the series in the pathway?
Right. So these are the 2 motor neurons in the pathway. Got a preganglionic neuron, which comes before the ganglion, and then a postganglionic neuron, which comes after the ganglion.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions before we go forward?
No.
Okay.
So you said the postganglionic neuron is unmyelinated, right? Is there a reason for it? Like, is it so that it'll receive the signals and it'll transmit it quickly, or how?
Yeah. So Tamim's question is, why is it that the postganglionic neuron is unmyelinated? That one I don't know. I don't know if there's a reason for it or if it just happens to just be like that. I'm not sure. And I'm not sure that that's an answer that's been kind of determined. All we know is that it is unmyelinated, and that's pretty much it.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So we'll come back to that in a bit here. But when we're looking at the autonomic nervous system, the ANS is going to be divided up into two different branches. And we're going to have the sympathetic division, and that is going to be responsible for your fight or flight responses. And then we have the parasympathetic division, which is responsible for your rest and digest response. Okay? So the sympathetic division, which regulates fight or flight, is going to be responsible for all the organs' activities that have to do with helping you escape from either danger or escape from emergency situations, or with exercise or with embarrassment, okay? or anything that's kind of a stressful environment or stressful situation. That is going to be where our sympathetic division is going to be active. Okay? And so a couple of kind of examples here with the sympathetic division. Here, for example, the heart is going to start to increase in speed, and when you're faced with a stressful situation, your airways are going to start to dilate, and that's going to help you to bring in more oxygen, so you can deliver more oxygen to different places that need it to help you escape from that danger or help you with that exercise. Okay? But at the same time, what we're also going to see is our GI tract is going to basically stop working, and then the bladder is also going to stop working, which is going to be important because, for example, we're trying to escape from a bear. Okay, we don't really want to have to stop to go pee to get away from when we're trying to get away from a bear, right? So the sympathetic division is going to be responsible for either exciting different organs to work or inhibiting the function of other organs in order to help you make sure that you're able to get out of that dangerous situation or escape from that stressful situation. Okay. All right, so that's going to be the sympathetic division. Okay. Regulating enhanced enhanced metabolic activities to get you away from emergency or emotional stress. The flip side of the sympathetic division is the parasympathetic division. Okay. And so the parasympathetic division is going to be responsible for your rest and digest, and that's going to be helping you to be able to conserve energy as well as store and restore your nutrient stores. Okay. And so that's going to be where your GI tract is going to be most active. So your GI tract is going to be active here to help you kind of take that nutrients that you've just eaten and then store it or either use it right away. And then also helping you with, contracting your bladder to help you go pee and things like that. So and also slowing your heart rate. So that's going to be one of those other things that you're going to be able to see. And so parasympathetic helps you with resting and digesting. Okay? Any function that helps you with that is going to be regulated by the parasympathetic division. And so what we'll see here is that most of the organs are going to have what's called dual innervation. Okay? What that means is that many organs are going to be able to be stimulated by either the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division at any one given point in time. Okay? They can receive stimulation from either one. However, only one is going to be active, okay, at any given point. Okay? So for example, the heart is going to have dual innervation because it can be stimulated by the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division. Okay? But it cannot be activated by both at the same time. Okay? So for example, the sympathetic division would cause your heart rate to increase, okay? While your parasympathetic division is going to cause your heart rate to decrease. Okay? So increased stimulation from either one is going to have different impacts on that particular organ that you're looking at. Okay. So kind of when we're looking at this whole big picture, okay, when we're looking at the motor pathway of the autonomic nervous system, again, we're going to see two motor neurons and then one autonomic ganglion. So again, the cell body of your preganglionic neuron is going to be found inside the CNS. Okay. As axon is going to leave as the cranial nerve or the spinal nerve, and then it's going to synapse with the postganglionic neuron inside the autonomic ganglion. And then from there, the postganglionic neuron will then stimulate the effector. Okay. One thing that is kind of important to kind of realize here is that the postganglionic neuron is going to be found entirely in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. So it is not inside the central nervous system in any way. Okay. It's completely outside of the central nervous system. And so the axon is eventually going to terminate inside its given effector. Okay. So when we look at all the preganglionic neurons and all the axons that leave from the CNS, and either whether you're looking at the sympathetic or the parasympathetic division, okay, those autonomic axons are going to end up creating some autonomic plexuses. Okay. And so these plexuses are going to be responsible for stimulating different organs inside the thorax, the abdomen, and in the pelvis. Okay, so this is what it would look like. And you don't need to worry about writing any of these. Don't worry about writing the slide down. But this is just to show you all the different plexuses that we can find inside our autonomic nervous system. So we're going to have a cardiac plexus that's going to supply the heart. There's going to be a pulmonary plexus, which is going to supply kind of your airways and your lungs. The celiac plexus, which is going to supply kind of your liver, your gallbladder, stomach, pancreas, kidneys, testes, and things like that. The mesenteric plexus, the superior and inferior mesenteric plexus, supplying the intestines. The hypogastric plexus supplying the viscera, the pelvic viscera, and then the renal plexus supplying the kidneys and the ureters. Okay. So all of these organs are going to have a variety of nerves, okay, autonomic nerves that are going to stimulate those particular structures. And so again, in order to reach them, you'd have a preganglionic neuron. It's either going to reach a sympathetic ganglion or a parasympathetic ganglion, and that is going to lead into a postganglionic neuron, okay, which will eventually reach the effect. Okay. Again, don't worry about writing down all the different plexuses. That's not important. Okay, so question here. So in the figure shown, what structure is indicated? Okay, so we had A, the autonomic ganglion containing cell bodies of preganglionic neurons. B, the autonomic ganglion containing cell bodies of postganglionic neurons. C, the adrenal medulla. D, the somatic ganglion containing cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. Or E, the posterior dorsal root ganglion.
Is it A?
What are we looking at?
It's gonna be B.
Did I hear B?
I would say B.
A.
Yes, B is correct. Right, so this would be an autonomic ganglion containing the cell bodies of postganglionic neurons. Right, perfect. Why is A not correct?
Because Gavilan, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the pre I know comes second, and the pre is unmyelinated and post is myelinated. So I just kind of looked at the. That's kind of like.
You're on the right track. Let me kind of ask it this way: where would we find the cell bodies of our preganglionic neurons? Where would they be located?
I don't know. I got.
No.
Anyone remember?
Reaction or what?
Wait, what was the question? What was the question again?
So where would we find the cell bodies of preganglionic neurons?
In the axon, right?
Oh, and
No.
So isn't it gonna be in the ganglion itself, in the dorsal root?
In the CNS?
No,
CNS.
not quite.
The CNS?
In the CNS.
Yes.
So the preganglionic cell bodies are going to be found inside the central nervous system.
Okay.
Right. So let me kind of we'll kind of draw this out a little bit here. So our preganglionic neuron, or our preganglionic axon, would be this portion here, and so running from here up to here. That would be our preganglionic our preganglionic neuron.
Mm-hmm.
So its cell body is going to be found inside the central nervous system.
Okay.
And whether it's in the brain or the spinal cord, it'll be found inside one of those two areas. That's going to be where we find the preganglionic neuron. So its cell body is going to be found inside the central nervous system. The cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons are going to be found inside the autonomic ganglion. Does that make sense so far? Let's start.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Let's look at D. So why does D not make sense?
It's a somatic ganglia. I mean, that's what I can see. It's different, but I don't contain somatic neurons.
So it is different in a way. Why is
Because
it?
I was thinking, the cell bodies of the somatic ganglion should, I don't know if this is the
Is it because it's sensory?
muscle fiber?
Yeah, is it because
Not quite. So the reason that D doesn't make sense is because when we're looking at the somatic nervous system, there are no ganglions. Okay? You just have a single somatic motor neuron running from the central nervous system directly to the muscle. So if we kind of go back, let me kind of clear this real quick. So if we go back to the somatic motor neuron, okay, we don't have a ganglion at all. Okay, you just have a single motor neuron running from the CNS directly to the muscle. So there's no ganglion present. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, you do have that ganglion because you have two different neurons that are necessary in order to stimulate an effector. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this one is a little bit more it's quite a bit more complicated than what we've seen previously.
It is a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So again, remember when you're looking at the preganglionic neuron, the preganglionic neuron is going to come before the ganglion. So you can say, before ganglion. Okay, so before the ganglion, that one's going to be the myelinated one. The postganglionic neuron will come after the ganglion. That is going to be the unmyelinated one. Okay? But its cell body is going to be found inside the ganglion itself. Okay. All right. So when we're looking at the autonomic nervous system, we're going to kind of divide our kind of adventure through this nervous system by looking at the sympathetic division first, and then we're going to look at the parasympathetic division. Okay. So when we're looking at the cell bodies of our sympathetic preganglionic neurons, those cell bodies are going to be found inside the thoracic regions of your spinal cord, as well as the L1 to L2 and possibly L3 regions of the spinal cord as well. Okay. So from T1 basically down to L2 to L3 is where we would find all of the cell bodies of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons. Okay. And so because all of these neurons because all these sympathetic neurons are all originating from either the thoracic or the lumbar segment of the spinal cord, we call those the thoracolumbar division. Okay. That's kind of another kind of nickname for the sympathetic axons here, okay, or sympathetic neurons. And so all the axons that are going to exit out of the thoracolumbar division, okay, are going to be called the thoracolumbar outflow. Okay. So all the axons coming from your sympathetic preganglionic neurons, which you see over here, okay, these would all be classified as the thoracolumbar outflow. So big picture here, sympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to be running from T1 to L3. Okay. So once those preganglionic axons exit out of the spinal cord, okay, they're going to exit out through the anterior rootlets, and then they're eventually going to move into the anterior ramus. Once they move into the anterior ramus, so remember we were looking at the anterior ramus branching off of the spinal cord in chapter 17. Once they leave the anterior ramus, they're then going to enter into a white ramus. Okay. And so the white ramus will then lead into one of these sympathetic trunk ganglia. So this is going to be where we're going to find the ganglia of our sympathetic motor neurons. And so that's going to be where they are going to penetrate into. And so those white rami, they're also kind of collectively as a whole called the white rami communicantes. Basically what they do is they just connect the spinal nerve to the sympathetic trunk ganglia. All right, so this is kind of what our sympathetic ganglia would look like. Okay. So inside of our sympathetic ganglia, we're going to have a bunch of preganglionic axons that are going to branch off pretty extensively. And so because there's so much branching at the axon terminals, they're going to be able to synapse with several postganglionic neurons inside this ganglia here. Okay. So because they're synapsing with so many postganglionic neurons, that helps to create a more widespread sympathetic effects throughout the body. Okay. And because you're able to stimulate multiple neurons at the same time in order to kind of produce your sympathetic responses. All right, everyone kind of following me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So once we have our preganglionic neurons enter into the ganglia, and one of the two ganglia that they can enter is called the sympathetic trunk ganglia. So the sympathetic trunk ganglia is a series of ganglia that run from the neck all the way down into the coccyx, and they lie on either side of the vertebral column. And so, like I said, they're going to receive all the preganglionic axons, specifically from the thoracic and the lumbar segments, which makes sense because that's going to be where we're going to find our sympathetic preganglionic axons coming from. So once our sympathetic ganglia, our sympathetic preganglionic neurons enter the sympathetic trunk ganglia, they're going to synapse with the postganglionic neurons. And when they synapse with the postganglionic neurons, those postganglionic neurons will then eventually synapse with the effectors, or their organs. In this case, their effectors could be the blood vessels, they could be sweat glands, they could be erector pili muscles, the heart, the lungs, any number of different organs throughout the body can be stimulated from the postganglionic neurons. So again, if we were kind of tracing this, here we have our spinal cord, our preganglionic neurons would reach our sympathetic trunk ganglia, which we see in this train here. So this is where we'd be seeing that synapse. Then the postganglionic neurons are going to exit out of this ganglia through another kind of ramus here, and they're eventually going to lead into their specific effectors. So that's one of the two ganglia or sets of ganglia that they can enter. Okay, the other set of ganglia is called the prevertebral ganglia. And these lie a little bit anterior to the vertebral column alongside the abdominal arteries. And so these ones will be able to stimulate specific abdominal and pelvic effectors. And so there's 5 major ganglia. You don't need to worry about the names of them, okay, but just know there's 5 of them. There's a celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, which is going to supply the intestines, inferior mesenteric ganglion, which also supplies the large intestine, and then the renal ganglion, which helps supply the kidneys, and then the aortorenal ganglion. Okay. Very complicated names, but again, don't worry about them. But just know that it can either enter this sympathetic trunk ganglia or the prevertebral ganglia, as we see over here. Again, exiting out of these ganglia, we're going to have postganglionic axons leading to their specific effectors. Okay, so that's the sympathetic division. Okay. Any questions on how the sympathetic division of these spinal cord is going to be oriented here? Okay. Or the nervous system, I should say. Okay. All right, so that's how the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is oriented. Okay. The parasympathetic division is going to be oriented a little bit differently, but it's going to kind of work kind of in a similar fashion. What we're going to have is we're going to be looking at our preganglionic neurons that are going to be coming from one of 2 places. Okay. Those preganglionic neurons can either come from the brain, specifically 4 cranial nerves inside the brainstem. Okay. Cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. Okay. The oculomotor, the facial, the hypoglossal, and the vagus nerve. Okay. Okay. And so they can exit as part of the cranial nerves, okay. Or they can exit as part of the S2 to L4 segments. And so for that reason, the parasympathetic division is usually kind of nicknamed the craniosacral division, because all of these axons in the parasympathetic division will either come from the cranial nerves or will come from the sacral spinal cord. And so the axons that leave these regions are going to be called the craniosacral outflow. Okay, so just kind of as a little bit more detail here. So the axons, like we mentioned before, the axons can either exit out from the cranial nerves, okay, And so if they exit from the cranial nerves, either in the pons or in the medulla, those those axons in those cranial nerves are specifically termed the cranial parasympathetic outflow, because those are where we find the preganglionic axons that leave from the cranial nerves. Okay. And then the ones that come from the sacral nerves are called the sacral parasympathetic outflow. Okay, so those are the axons there, the preganglionic axons. Now, when we look at those preganglionic axons, they're going to eventually reach what's called a terminal ganglion. Okay. That terminal ganglion is going to be where the preganglionic parasympathetic axons are going to synapse with postganglionic parasympathetic neurons. So, those terminal ganglia are just a fancy way of saying the parasympathetic ganglia here. But the reason they're called terminal ganglia is because they lie very, very close and sometimes even inside the walls of that particular visceral organ. Okay? So for example, you might have a terminal ganglia, okay, inside the wall of the heart, okay, or inside the walls of the liver or the gallbladder or the stomach. Okay? And so that's a little bit different from the sympathetic division, where the ganglia was kind of in that midway point, or sometimes somewhere in the middle of those particular neurons. Okay. Inside the parasympathetic division, the ganglia is usually going to be very close to, or sometimes inside the walls of the effector organ. Okay. And so for that reason, the preganglionic axons typically are a lot longer, okay, than the sympathetic preganglionic neurons that we saw previously. Now these ganglionic, or these preganglionic neurons here, they don't branch nearly as extensively as the sympathetic preganglionic neurons do. They usually will only synapse with about 4 to 5 neurons. But each of those postganglionic neurons that get stimulated is going to supply stimulation to that specific effector organ, okay, a single effector organ. Okay. So for example, we might have a preganglionic neuron that runs into the walls of the heart. It might synapse with about 4 to 5 postganglionic neurons, but all 4 of those, or all of those postganglionic neurons, are going to stimulate the heart itself. Now, the majority of the preganglionic outflow, or is going to come specifically from the vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10. Okay. So cranial nerve 10 is going to be what stimulates the majority of our visceral organs. Okay. The other 3 and the spinal cord account for the other 20% of the parasympathetic outflow. Okay. But the large majority of it is going to come from the preganglionic neurons that make up the vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve is the only one that works outside of the head and neck, or right?
Not the only one, but it does the most. It basically does the most work. So cranial nerves 3, 7, and 9. Okay. 3, 7, and 9, they also have a little bit of a role, but they're mainly with structures inside the head. Okay. But the vagus nerve will pretty much do everything else. Yeah. Any other questions here? Okay. All right, so this is kind of what the parasympathetic division would look like. Okay. Any questions on the parasympathetic division before we go forward? No? Okay. So the last kind of component of the autonomic nervous system is the enteric division. The enteric division is mainly geared to work specifically with just the GI tract. Okay. So just your digestive system. There's going to be 2 major plexuses inside the enteric division. Those would be the myenteric plexus as well as the submucosal plexus. For the sake of our lecture today, don't worry about these. We'll talk about this more when we hit the digestive system. Okay. But just know again that it is part of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. All right, so we looked at the sympathetic division and kind of how those neurons are going to be organized. We looked at the parasympathetic division and how those neurons are organized. So now we're going to kind of look at the specific neurons and what they're going to be releasing as their neurotransmitters. Okay. So we've got 2 different types of neurons that we're going to be seeing kind of in terms of the neurotransmitters they're going to be releasing. Okay. The first type is called a cholinergic neuron. And so cholinergic neurons are neurons that will release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in order to stimulate the next neuron or the effector. So when we're looking at the ANS, we're going to find cholinergic neurons in 3 overall places. The first one is going to be whenever you're looking at a preganglionic neuron. So all preganglionic neurons, whether they're sympathetic or parasympathetic neurons, will always be releasing acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. Okay. That's number 1. Okay. So preganglionic neurons always release acetylcholine. Number 2 is whenever we're looking at sympathetic postganglionic neurons, okay, that stimulate sweat glands. Okay. So here you've got a sweat gland. Okay. Whenever you're sweating, okay, your sympathetic division is going to be active, okay, but we're going to be releasing acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter for postganglionic neurons as well. Okay. And then the last one are parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. So parasympathetic postganglionic neurons will always release acetylcholine. Okay, so those are the 3 major places. Okay. Number 1, whether if it's a preganglionic neuron, it will always release acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. Okay. Number 2, if you're looking at a sympathetic postganglionic neuron, okay, that is innervating a sweat gland, okay, that is also going to release acetylcholine. Okay. And then number 3, any parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are also going to be releasing acetylcholine. Okay, so those are the 3 places where we'll see cholinergic neurons. Again, cholinergic meaning a neuron that releases acetylcholine. Okay. So when we're looking at acetylcholine, acetylcholine is going to end up binding to acetylcholine receptors. And we have 2 types of acetylcholine receptors. Okay. So these acetylcholine receptors we call cholinergic receptors. So cholinergic neurons and cholinergic receptors. Okay, and again, one way you can kind of remember that is a choline here. Cholinergic is going to release acetylcholine. Okay. Same word, just kind of in a different manner here. So cholinergic receptors are going to be on the postsynaptic plasma membrane. The first type of cholinergic receptor we can have are nicotinic receptors. And so nicotinic receptors, you can abbreviate them as NACHR, from nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And so those are always going to be found on the dendrites or cell bodies of sympathetic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. Okay. So any postganglionic neuron is going to have a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. Okay. And the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are also found on the neuromuscular junction. And so these nicotinic cholinergic receptors are going to be responsible for producing excitation of the postsynaptic cell, whether it's a neuron or an effector. The second type of receptor we can have are called the muscarinic receptors. And so muscarinic receptors are found on, muscarinic receptors are specifically found on the effectors of parasympathetic postganglionic axons. That's what we're going to be, where we're going to see our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands that are going to contain muscarinic receptors here. Now, muscarinic receptors are a little bit different than the nicotinic receptors because depending on the specific cell that they're found on, they can either cause excitation of that effector cell, or they can cause inhibition of that effector. Again, just depending on the type of cell we're looking at. Okay. Now, in order to get rid of that acetylcholine, we're going to be using an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. And so acetylcholinesterase, or ACHE, works very, very quickly to break down acetylcholine. And so once it breaks it down, acetylcholine no longer has its effect. And so acetylcholinesterase works very, very quickly to get rid of acetylcholine. Okay, so again, nicotinic receptors can be found on sympathetic and parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, while muscarinic receptors are going to be found on parasympathetic postganglionic effectors. Okay. Any questions on cholinergic receptors?
No.
All right, so that's one type of receptor that we can find inside the autonomic nervous system. Okay. The other type of receptor that we can find are called the adrenergic receptors. Okay. So adrenergic neurons are going to release hormones called norepinephrine or epinephrine. Okay. These hormones also have another name called adrenaline, okay, which is kind of where these neurons and receptors get their name from. Okay. So norepinephrine and epinephrine are just the same thing as adrenaline. So those are going to respond to adrenergic receptors. So adrenergic receptors are going to be found on sympathetic postganglionic neurons. And so this kind of makes sense because, again, if you're thinking of your sympathetic division, the sympathetic division is going to be activated whenever you're in fight or flight mode. Okay? When you're escaping from danger, or if you're, face to face with a bear, you're going to have a lot of adrenaline coming into play. Okay? Adrenaline, again, being the same thing as norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay. So whenever you see norepinephrine being used as the neurotransmitter, okay, you know you're looking at the sympathetic division being activated. Okay. Anything else would be parasympathetic or a sweat gland. Okay. So in this case, we see a norepinephrine. Again, that's adrenaline. Adrenaline cues up the sympathetic division. Okay. So sympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to release the norepinephrine or epinephrine. And so they're going to act as the adrenergic receptors here. So similar to any other neurotransmitter that we've seen in the past, norepinephrine is going to get packed into vesicles, and then it's going to end up getting released through exocytosis by that particular neuron. Now, in the case of the adrenal medulla, which is an adrenal gland we'll look at next week, norepinephrine and epinephrine can also be dropped off into the blood. And again, we'll look at that next week, but that is going to be how we're able to see these very widespread effects of adrenaline and norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay. So these adrenergic receptors are going to be found on the postsynaptic membrane, and they're going to be binding onto norepinephrine and epinephrine. That is going to be their job. All right, so when we're looking at adrenergic receptors, again, we've got two kind of major overall subtypes of these receptors. Okay, the first ones are the alpha receptors, and then we have beta receptors. Okay. So alpha receptors and beta receptors are going to be responsible for binding onto norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay. Those are the two types of adrenergic receptors we can have. So like I said, they're going to be found on the postsynaptic membrane, and specifically on your effector organs. Any effector organ that gets stimulated by sympathetic postganglionic axons. So different types of cells can be exposed or can have either alpha receptors or beta receptors, and there's some that can have both. Okay? It just kind of depends on the cell that you're looking at. Okay? However, norepinephrine is going to be able to bind more tightly and more strongly onto alpha receptors than beta receptors. Okay? However, epinephrine is going to be able to bind onto both receptors pretty equally. But yeah. So those are the two overall receptors then. Alpha receptors and then beta receptors. Now, in order to get rid of norepinephrine, there's two things that we can do. Okay? Number one is we can go through reuptake, where you just pump that norepinephrine back into the preganglionic neuron, or sorry, into the neuron that it came from. In this case, a postganglionic neuron. Okay. Pack it back into the vesicles, and then you're good to go. You're just basically recycling your norepinephrine from the synaptic clefts. Okay. That's option A, just reuptaking. The other option is you can degrade it, okay? And you can degrade it using two different enzymes. Okay? The first enzyme is called COMT, or catechol O methyltransferase. So COMT or monoamine oxidase, or MAO. Okay. Either of these two enzymes is able to degrade norepinephrine. Okay. Once you destroy it, it no longer is able to bind to the receptors, and then as a result, you no longer get the effects you were looking for, okay, or you had at the beginning. Okay. However, norepinephrine stays in the synaptic cleft for a longer period of time than acetylcholine does. Okay? And so for that reason, it usually has a longer lasting effect than acetylcholine. Okay? So for example, has anyone ever been like walking down the street and almost got hit by a car? Okay? And so your fight or flight mode starts to kick up. Okay?
Yeah.
But it takes you a long time for you to come down from that kind of high adrenaline state. Okay? Come down from that kind of highly kind of emotional state. Okay? The reason for that is because once you release norepinephrine, it just stays in the synaptic cleft longer. It continues to bind to those receptors and create those constant sympathetic responses. Okay? And so for that reason, it takes a lot longer for you to come down from that sympathetic, from those sympathetic responses. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So you said there's only 2 options then? So option A is reuptake, or option B is COMT or MAO?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So you got 2 options to degrade norepinephrine in order to kind of terminate its effects. You can either reuptake it and put it back into the neuron it came from, in this case our postganglionic neuron, or you can degrade it down using COMT or MAO. Those are the 2 ways. But either way, they both take a relatively long period of time, or a longer period of time than acetylcholine does. Okay. Any questions on these receptors? Adrenergic receptors and then the cholinergic receptors.
No.
No, not right now.
Yeah. Same.
Okay, cool. All right, so question here. So all sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons release which neurotransmitter? Okay, we got acetylcholine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, or dopamine.
Acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine, perfect, right. So regardless of whether you're a sympathetic or parasympathetic preganglionic neuron, okay, all preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. No exceptions. Cool. All right, cool. Number 2. Which of these substances listed below binds to adrenergic receptors? So you got acetylcholine, epinephrine, nicotine, or norepinephrine.
Should be
D?
epinephrine
2
and
and 4, I think, right?
norepinephrine. 2 and 4.
Yeah.
2 and 4, yes. 2 and 4 is correct. Yeah, so epinephrine and norepinephrine are both going to bind to adrenergic receptors. Okay, remember, those are going to be kind of the more specific
Adrenaline,
names for
noradrenaline,
adrenaline. Adrenaline will always bind to the adrenergic receptors here. Okay. Next question. So this one's a little bit of a kind of a tougher question here. So which division is shown in the figure here? Okay. Is this a parasympathetic division? Is this the sympathetic division, somatic, nicotinic, or muscarinic division? What are we looking at here?
I think the sympathetic.
What did you say, Sharon?
The sympathetic?
You said sympathetic?
I think so. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I agree
Okay.
with her on that one.
Yeah, it should be sympathetic.
Yes, the answer is sympathetic. Right. So the sympathetic division, how do we know that we're looking at the sympathetic division here? Anyone have an idea?
Is it because it's accepting norepinephrine on the
Right.
post-ganglionic neuron?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So Priscilla had mentioned, because we're looking at norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that will always be giving rise to the sympathetic division, or will always be found inside the sympathetic division. And again, one way that you can kind of remember that, norepinephrine is adrenaline. I'll just put adrenaline. Okay, I'll just put adrenaline. Okay. Adrenaline is going to be something you release when you're in your fight or flight mode. Okay. And so that is going to bring us to our sympathetic division. Okay. So whenever you see norepinephrine, think adrenaline. When you have adrenaline, you think fight or flight, which would be your sympathetic division. Oh. Okay. Any questions here? Okay. All right. So that is the autonomic nervous system. And so, like we've seen, the autonomic nervous system is very, very complicated.
Yeah.
And it has to be able to control many, many different things, and many different organs, and be able to control the functions of each of those organs. So in order to regulate the sympathetic activity and the parasympathetic activity, we need the hypothalamus. So one of the major roles of the hypothalamus is going to be regulating which division of the autonomic nervous system is going to be active at a given point in time. Okay. So it's going to help to increase your sympathetic activity, and at the same time you increase your sympathetic activity, you're going to decrease your parasympathetic activity, and vice versa. Okay, remember, both cannot be active at the same time. You cannot have the sympathetic and parasympathetic being active at the same time because they have countering effects. Okay. So the hypothalamus is going to be responsible for activating one or the other. Now, each of the divisions, each of the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions is going to impact the effector organs differently. And the reason for that is going to be because of the difference in the neurotransmitters that are getting released, as well as the different types of receptors that are going to be found on the effector organ. So, for example, the sympathetic division is going to release norepinephrine, and so norepinephrine is going to have a different effect than acetylcholine, which gets released from the parasympathetic division. So because you're releasing two different neurotransmitters, you're going to end up getting two different effects. And so the same thing is going to be the case with the receptors. Okay? Depending on the specific receptor that gets activated, that's going to lead to specific effects that are going to be taking place inside that particular organ. Okay. All right, so we're going to now take a look at different types of responses, kind of overall body responses that we're going to see, which each individual division of the ANS. Okay. And so we're going to look at the sympathetic division first. And so the sympathetic responses are going to occur whenever you're in some kind of physical stress, emotional stress, or whenever you need to produce or use large amounts of ATP. Okay. And so the sympathetic responses are going to typically be implemented with the 4 E's. Okay. The first E being exercise, emergency, excitement, or embarrassment. Any one of those 4 situations is going to lead to the sympathetic responses becoming activated. Okay. And so this particular division of the ANS is going to be used to help you to help you use up energy. Okay. You don't want to be storing energy during these processes because, again, you want to use energy to help you get out of whatever stressful situation you're in. Okay. So we're going to not favor energy storage here. So there's going to be 7 kind of overall responses that we're going to be seeing with this sympathetic division. The first one that we're going to see is that the pupils of the eyes are going to dilate. Okay? The reason the pupils of your eyes are going to dilate, and we'll look at this in more detail on Wednesday when we look at the special senses, is by dilating the pupils, you allow more light to enter your eyes. Okay? So if you're in an environment where you're trying to escape from a bear, for example, okay? Let's say you're trying to escape from a bear, you want as much light coming into your eyes as possible because that's going to allow you to be able to see your surroundings a lot better. Okay? So dilating your pupils is going to be helpful to help you escape from danger in certain situations. Okay. That's number 1. Okay. Number 2 is it's going to cause your heart rate and the force of your heart contraction as well as your blood pressure to all increase. Okay. Those are all going to increase because, again, if you're trying to escape from danger, you want your heart to be pumping nice and hard. Okay. As the heart pumps harder, it's going to be able to push more blood, okay, to the organs that are going to be helpful to help you escape from that danger, okay, or to help you with your exercise or whatever it may be. Okay. By directing more blood to those particular organs or muscles, you're going to be directing more oxygen and more glucose to those organs, which will help them be able to not fatigue as quickly and be able to be as active as possible. Okay. The third function is it's going to help with dilating the organs, dilating the blood vessels around the organs that are helpful for you to escape from that particular danger. Okay? So again, if we're trying to escape from a bear, okay, the blood vessels around our skeletal muscles, specifically around our legs, are going to start to dilate. Okay? And again, that's going to dilate because as they dilate, you're going to be able to direct more blood to your leg muscles. As you direct more blood to your leg muscles, you're going to be supplying them with more oxygen, and your leg muscles are going to be less prone to fatigue when you're trying to outrun a bear. Okay. So that's going to help you kind of escape from danger in that particular situation as well. Okay. So that's number 3. Number 4 is it's going to help with dilating your airways. Okay. As you dilate your airways, you're going to allow more oxygen to come into your lungs. As you have more oxygen coming into your lungs, you have more oxygen getting into the blood, and then again, more oxygen getting to the organs that are going to help you escape from danger or help you with your exercise or whatever it may be. So those are kind of from a cardiovascular component and from the eyes. From a glucose perspective, one of the things that's going to happen is what's called glycogenolysis. Okay? And so glycogenolysis is a process that takes place in the liver where you break down glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose. Okay? You break down glycogen, these large glycogen molecules, into individual glucose molecules. And then that glucose can then be used to help you produce ATP, which will then help you, have more energy available to get you to help to maximize your exercise or escape from danger, or whatever it may be. The flip side of that is we're going to have triglycerides that we can break down into fatty acids and glycerol. That's called lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat. And again, that can be used for also ATP production as well. So that's going to help with ATP production. The next thing that's going to happen is our glucose. Our liver is going to release more glucose into the blood. As you direct more glucose into the blood, you have more blood or more glucose getting into specific organs, which can then use that glucose to produce ATP through cellular respiration. And then the last thing that's going to happen is that if there's any processes that are not essential to help you escape from danger or help you with exercise, those functions are going to be inhibited. Okay? So for example, you might have a full bladder, right? But if you're trying to escape from a bear, okay, your bladder is not going to contract because you don't want to be, peeing when you're trying to get away from a bear. Okay? You don't want to have your digestive tracts kind of helping you to digest blood or digest food, okay? Because again, that's not going to help you escape from that bear. Okay? It's not immediately essential, so those particular functions are going to shut down until it's okay to, flip those things back on again. Okay. Any questions on these sympathetic responses?
No.
I was going to say, I think that's kind of one of the reasons why sometimes people look pale, because like the blood goes away from your, from the surface and goes to your necessary areas.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Josue mentioned that that's the reason why people look pale. So when people are pale whenever they come into a very stressful situation, the reason for that is because their sympathetic division has activated pretty quick and pretty extensively. Okay? And so instead of directing blood to your skin, okay, it's going to direct blood away from the skin and to the organs that are going to be responsible for helping you get out of that danger. And so because your blood vessels around the skin are no longer as dilated and they're more constricted, okay, there's not going to be as much blood flowing to the skin, and so you're going to end up looking more pale because again you're shunting more blood to the organs that are going to help you with your fight or flight scenario. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, yeah, very good, Josue. Very good connection there. Okay. So again, when we're looking at these sympathetic responses, these are going to last a lot longer than parasympathetic responses for 3 overall reasons. Okay, number 1 is when we were looking at these sympathetic axons, right? Those sympathetic postganglionic axons are able to branch off much more extensively than parasympathetic ones. Okay? And so because they branch off more extensively, they're able to stimulate more muscle or more tissues at the same time. Okay? And so as a result, you end up with multiple different organs and multiple different tissues all being activated by sympathetic activation, whereas the parasympathetic division only stimulates a few different structures and specifically only one individual effector at a time. Number 2 is that the norepinephrine, like we mentioned earlier, is going to stay in the synaptic cleft longer than acetylcholine does. And so because of that reason, norepinephrine is going to stay balanced with the receptors and then produce those effects for a longer period of time. And then the third function is, or the third reason is because epinephrine and norepinephrine can also be released in the blood. And so if they get released in the blood, they're able to move throughout the body very, very quickly and create a more widespread sympathetic responses across multiple organs at the same time. So essentially what the sympathetic division is able to do is it's able to activate multiple tissues and multiple organs all at once because of the divergence of the postganglionic axons and because of norepinephrine and epinephrine getting released in the blood. And then the last reason, because norepinephrine stays in the synaptic cleft for a long period of time. All right, so there is a couple drugs that are responsible for helping with kind of toning down specifically blood pressure and your heart rate. And so for people who deal with hypertension, they have an constantly elevated blood pressure. And so one way that, and so that's what's called hypertension. And so one way that you can kind of help to tone down someone's hypertension is by treating them with what's called a beta blocker. And so there's two major beta blockers. There's propranolol and then metoprolol. And so these are medications that will help to block the beta receptors. And so because they block the beta receptors, they do not let epinephrine bind. And so what epinephrine would normally do to beta receptors is they would cause, actually, let me try saying that one more time. I'm going to backtrack. I'm going to start from the beginning here. So epinephrine, what epinephrine will normally do is it'll bind to blood vessels. Okay? It'll bind to blood vessels and cause those blood vessels to constrict. Okay? When those blood vessels constrict, it increases the blood pressure. Okay? And so what these beta blockers will do, propranolol and metoprolol will do, is they will block the beta receptors. Okay? And so when they block the beta receptors, they don't let epinephrine bind onto those receptors and ultimately prevent epinephrine from causing those receptors from constricting. And so they end up staying dilated. And so if those vessels end up staying dilated, they help to decrease the blood pressure. Okay? So these medications help to decrease blood pressure as well as decreasing your heart rate and the contractility of the heart, the strength of its contraction, okay? Just by blocking beta receptors on the blood vessels and on the heart using these specific medications. And so the whole goal of that is to decrease someone's blood pressure. Okay, that's that. Okay, any questions on these sympathetic responses? Any other questions here before we move forward? Okay, so then the last one is the parasympathetic responses. So parasympathetic responses, these are going to regulate your rest and digest activities. So this is going to be any body function that's going to help you conserve energy or restore your nutrient stores. Particularly during times when you're resting or recovering from exercise or recovering from a stressful situation or whatever it may be, or after a meal or whatever it may be. Okay, and so in between periods of exercise, the parasympathetic division is going to send impulses to the digestive tract as well as to the smooth muscle of the GI tract. And that's going to help you with causing your GI tract to be able to break down food and help you with your digestion. Okay. So that is going to dominate over the sympathetic division. So when we're looking at parasympathetic responses, we're going to see kind of a general trend of responses. The first one that you can use is kind of what's called SLUD. The S stands for salivation. Okay, again, that's going to help with your digestion. Okay. Lacrimation, which is your crying. Urination, digestion, and defecation. Those are all going to be dictated by the parasympathetic division. And then we're also going to see three major decreases that are going to happen. Okay. So we're going to see a decrease in heart rate because, again, we're not in a stressful situation. Okay. Because we're not in a stressful situation, we have our heart rate just decline. And because we're resting here. Okay. So heart rate is going to decrease. The diameter of your airways is going to decrease because you don't need to bring in as much oxygen to supply all your organs, okay, as you would in a stressful situation. Okay. And the diameter of the pupils is also going to constrict it as well. Okay? Because you don't need to let as much light in because, again, your environment is not going to be as stressful. So all of those would be responses that are dictated by the parasympathetic response. But again, there's a lot more that kind of goes into this, more than just what we see here. Okay. All right. So again, as we see here, a lot of the organs are going to be stimulated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. They're going to have innervation from both, and that is what we call dual innervation. The heart is going to have innervation from this, the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. The salivary glands are going to have innervation from the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and so on and so forth. Same thing with the bladder. Same thing with the reproductive tract, and you know, any other organ that we're going to see in our thoracic and abdominal cavities. Okay, so question here. So which of the following is not a sympathetic response? Okay, so we have A, the pupils of the eyes dilate. B, the heart rate, force of heart contraction, and blood pressure increase. C, the airways dilate, allowing faster movement of air into and out of the lungs. D, decreased secretion from salivary glands. And E, increased motility in the stomach and intestines. Which one is not a sympathetic response?
E.
E.
Increased mobility in stomach.
Yes, E is correct. Right. So E is not a sympathetic response because, again, you do not want your GI tract active when you're trying to escape from danger, because that's blood that's going to your GI tract that could be getting used elsewhere to help you actually survive.
What? It's okay. It's okay. Come here.
Okay. Last thing here is the autonomic reflexes. Okay. So we have autonomic reflexes that are going to also kind of follow the same reflex arc we've seen previously. So these autonomic reflexes are going to be found starting with an autonomic receptor. Okay? And that receptor is going to pick up on a stimulus inside one of your organs. Okay? It's going to produce a change and then create an action potential going along that particular sensory neuron. Okay? That sensory neuron will then take that information, conduct it to the central nervous system. From there, the central nervous system will then integrate that sensory information, most likely in the hypothalamus and the brainstem, although it can sometimes be in the spinal cord as well. But usually it'll be inside the hypothalamus and the brainstem. And then the integrating center will then conduct that information from the sensory neurons directly to the motor neurons. Those motor neurons will then send an impulse to the effector using those preganglionic and postganglionic motor neurons. And then eventually you reach your effector, which is going to be your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Okay. So same pathway we've seen previously, there's just a little bit more specifics here. Okay, so these autonomic reflexes are going to be really, really important for helping to regulate different aspects of our survival and our day-to-day activities. Okay. One of the things that we need to be able to regulate using autonomic reflexes is the blood pressure. Okay. So we want to regulate blood pressure by adjusting our heart rate, the force of the ventricles contracting, as well as the blood vessel diameter. Okay. So by taking in kind of all of these different types of activities, we're going to be able to regulate your blood pressure. Okay. The autonomic reflexes are also responsible for your GI motility, okay. Specifically the muscle tone of your GI tract and how it's able to move and contract to help move food from one area to another. Okay. So for example, some intestines might stretch as they accommodate more food, or the stomach might stretch as it accommodates more food. Okay. Those are going to be sent by sensory neurons. Okay. The sensory neurons will then eventually reach the integrating center. The motor neurons are then going to cause contraction of the GI tract. It's to help you either break down food or move the food further along in the GI tract. And then we're also going to see some sphincters. Okay. And so some sphincters are going to be found specifically when it comes to urination and defecation. And those are going to be helpful to allow you to be able to pee into poop. Okay. So those are all going to be reflexes, a few different reflexes that are going to be responsible or determined by the autonomic reflexes. Okay, and that is it for today with the autonomic nervous system. So I know it's very complicated. It's kind of a shortish lecture, but it is very, very complicated. Any questions on anything we've covered today?
It is complicated, huh?
Yeah.
I had a hard time
extremely,
gripping
extremely
some
complicated.
things, but I definitely have to go back and reread some things. But yeah.
It's complicated, but it's very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So it is really interesting, and like I said, this is what controls pretty much everything else in the body that's going to be vital for our survival. And so, but because all those things are so important to our survival, they also have to be kind of regulated in a very complicated manner, which makes things a little bit difficult for us. But without it, kind of we'd be in some trouble without it.
So when Josue was mentioning earlier something, and I thought when the light comes in, when your pupils want the light in, then melatonin gets held back because melatonin gets released when it's dark, right?
Yes.
Okay, so a lot of things I could understand now why some things are inhibited while others are excited.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's really good. They kind of connected two different things here. Yeah. So with light, right, when we're in a situation where we're kind of in a stressful environment, or when we're trying to escape from danger, what we want is to make sure that we're getting as much light into our eyes as possible. Yeah. At the same time, we don't want to be producing melatonin, because melatonin is going to make us fall asleep, and so we don't want to be trying to escape from a bear, and then all of a sudden we get real tired, start falling asleep, and then all of a sudden now a bear is able to eat us up.
Have a nice meal.
So that's gonna be kind of a twofold kind of process there. Yeah, real good.
So the body's pretty good at conserving energy, turning things off to be efficient, to work efficiently.
Yes.
I like that.
Yeah, it's really good at being able to regulate everything.
Yeah. Okay, this was a good lecture. Thank you, Professor.
Cool. I'm glad.
Okay.
No problem.
Bye.
So there's no questions. You guys are free to go. Again, there's no lab for this section, so don't worry about doing any lab. But there will be an extra credit lab for Wednesday's lecture.
Will there be homework, George?
Yeah, there will be homework due next Monday.
Okay, for sure.
Thank you, George.
All right. Yeah, thank you, George.
No problem.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
No problem.
Bye.
Have a good one.
You too.
All right, you too.